So, my name is Ante Karamatić. I come from, obviously, Zagreb. And the same as the previous keynote speaker, Mr. Vignoli, last time I was here was exactly 2011. And that time I had a technical presentation, and this time I'm going to go over something that I've witnessed in the recent history about trying to implement open source solutions for various big companies across the globe, and talk about something that I think is more important than code when we are facing customers, in my case. But it might be good to hear if you're planning on having an open source project and trying to gather some users. So I'm going to start with a question, a simple one. Will Joe Average, and there is a person called Joe Average, he's a Canadian artist, so in this case this is not that person, but a Joe Average, would he better off by using open source software? Just a simple question. Any comments? Yes? Okay, we have a no here. Any yes? How much of you thinks that just by using open source software, a person will have a better experience, better life, or be a more positive person in general? Okay, that's not a majority, just so you know. So I'm going to show you an example of two pretty big customers that have been working in the last year or so. Let's call them Telco A and Telco B. And they wanted to implement infrastructure as a service. In the previous session, you probably saw the OpenStack as being one of the biggest open source projects, and that's exactly what they were implementing. So one customer had very specific requirements. They knew what they wanted. They had a requirement that the software that is implemented is open source. They reviewed the software. They had specific requests for features. They had already established organization to continue development in DevOps mode, and they were purely looking for software. The Telco B had no idea what open source means, had no requests for any features, and didn't have any... Sure? Or I can put it closer. Well, let's wait for people to come in. Okay. So the Telco B, they were just looking for a solution. They didn't have any development team, anything. They were just looking for a solution that will bring them closer to their goal. Which one of you, or these two, you think had a better experience in implementing their solution? A or B? A? Well, so Telco A had a lot of people that they put in place in their organization. They established everything. They bought a lot of books. Trust me, a lot of books. When we started working with these people, it was like reading the book and having no material experience in doing things. So what we've seen there is that they built an organization, but the mentality in those people, even though they didn't have a telco background, they were working for a telco company, so therefore they had a telco mentality, which was, I'm going to buy this from this vendor, and I'm going to talk to this vendor if anything doesn't work. So whether this vendor is giving me open source or not is really irrelevant. But in their RFP, when they were asking for a proposal, they were asking, So they were asking for an open source solution. It was a requirement because we sold them a story that an open source solution prevents a vendor lock-in. And I'll go later on explaining why this is not true. But we sold them this idea, we as an open source community, that just by asking for an open source solution, they will be able to switch to any vendor they want later on. At the same time, while they were believing that they built a DevOps organization, we had their engineers coming in and saying, but we are not allowed to contribute the code to your product or project. We had an open source project, which was contributed by many various companies, by direct competitors in the market, but these guys were not allowed to contribute back. So whole story about the DevOps fall through the cracks. And on top of everything, when we sold the open source solution as a basic infrastructure as a service platform, they came up with a closed source SDN to put on top of it. SDN is, for those that are not aware of it, it's software-defined networking. It's a thing that ties together the network aspects on the virtualization, irrelevant. So telco B complexities, this is the one that didn't care about anything. They had no complexities. They bought the solution, they came up into production within 6 months, and that was it. They were up and running with the open source software, with an open source SDN, and they didn't care about how things are working. And this is the customer that didn't ask for open source solution. So let's go back to the telco A. What were the challenges there? It's being in a position of a software vendor, a company that was providing the solution. What we were facing when we came to the customer was not a software or technology problem. It was a cultural problem. They were not getting the idea of working on the code and contributing back that code. This was all closed for them. They know that it's open source and they like it because, again, we told them that this is great, but they don't see any benefit in that. They are not exercising the benefit of open source software. They also had an organization which was really weird, which this allowed them to do proper operations of their platform, not yet alone the code development. The operations of the platform was impossible because of the complexities in their cultural way of thinking, in the way they organize their organization. So we had a person who was super experienced in Python coming up to us and saying, can you fix this problem in a Python code? It was a 2-line patch. And he was asking us to do it, which is, you would agree, completely opposite from what DevOps engineers should do. If it's an easy problem to solve, DevOps engineers should do it overnight, basically, in a sleep. And what this led to in the end is that the company, which was requiring the open source solutions, ended up buying closed source plugins because they realized that the people that they have cannot contribute and cannot make this open source work. So again, we have a telco A who was very open source go for, telco B who didn't care, and telco B ended up in the production with open source software, and telco A got stuck. So again, as a vendor company, as a software vendor company, we ended up working there as a psychologist. We ended up working with people and trying to teach them how to communicate, first of all, not how to contribute code. That was the least of our problems. They were all pessimistic in the company because the misorganization led them to frustration. They've seen the problems, they know how to fix them, they can't contribute, they're not sure how to contribute, they fail completely. So what we did is, as I wrote here, we put some optimism into the company first. This was a month work, a software company doing people management for a telco. So we spent a month just on that. Then we moved into the isolating the people who are actually capable of doing these things that we are asking them, or what their management is expecting from them. We nurture those people till they become people who can lead the other people. Because in the beginning, when we came for the first time, they had, I don't know what would be proper expression in English, but it's one person would report to 2 different people. One would be the technical lead, so this is the guy that knows the code, and the other one would be the people manager. So, and these 2 guys were not really in sync. This is, again, as you can see, this is more a customer problem than a technology problem, but it shows that just going precisely for an open source doesn't mean anything. You need to have a company which is in line with what they want to achieve. Again, with all these problems, what we had to do with them is review their hiring policy. And we are a software company, reviewing the hiring policy for another company. Eventually, we convinced them that they need to reorg a little bit. And this was all done in secrets, where we were talking to their managers, and the engineers didn't know anything about. But eventually, they reorganized a little bit, and now I'm going to show you the results. I think, oh no, I forgot how the slides go. Anyway, so my question is open source just about the code? I'm in personal dilemma here. If we say that open source is just the way how we develop code, then why the company who is so eager on open source is so failing? Are we missing something? The other company that didn't care about the code, is it open source or the closed source, didn't fail at all. Some of you are using their products right now without even knowing that. So I think it's more than just the code. I think there are great benefits that come with the open source code, but there are also a lot of costs. Previously, in the old days, the software cost money. Today, people cost money. Buying a $10,000 software is not a problem these days. So VMware is really an option. It's just $10,000. Because the people who are going to manage it cost $300,000 a year, right? So what is the price of the software? It's irrelevant for the price for the whole solution. When we talk about other things that are around the open source code, we usually talk about the mailing lists, the community, the wiki pages, whatnot. And we think that these are not about the code, but they are. They are about the code. Like we have the mailing list, how we can contribute the code better. We don't have a mailing list on how to resolve personal issues. There are developments in that area. Obviously, we have code of conducts and things like that, which are developing. But still, most of the open source movement, let's call it that way, is still organized around the code. And I said in the beginning, and I'm going to repeat it again, the open source does not prevent vendor lock-in. Does not. The vendor lock-in used to be, let's take an example of the Office platform. You buy Microsoft Office, you create a document, later on you get LibreOffice and you can't open that document. Yes, that's a vendor lock-in. But there are vendor lock-ins currently that are on the business level, not on the software level. So you have open source companies that are producing infrastructure as a cloud and do not support their VMs running on anything but their infrastructure as a service. That's a vendor lock-in, right? If I can't run your software anywhere else than on your platform, it's a vendor lock-in. So, as I said, open source for me is more than a code. And I put here people feelings matter is because this is something that we constantly ignore because we focus so much on the code and on the things that we will materialize out of the work that we do. But people feelings matter. And if the people who are working on the code or in the organization that you're working with do not feel well, it's irrelevant if it's an open source or closed source. If you're coming to a person who is frustrated because of the lack of parking space for the car, the open source is not going to change his view. And the thing is, if you introduce him to open source, he's going to be frustrated already, so he's going to reject the open source. He doesn't want to change anything. So it's very important to get the people to a good state before you introduce them to open source software. And again, code itself solves nothing for non-engineers. This is purely LibreOffice problem. Like LibreOffice is a great platform and we can all hack on it. But does it solve everybody's problem? Does it solve average Joe's problem around opening Microsoft Office documents? So there is a good thing around everything, around this story in the end. The telco A today, well, they managed to reorganize a little bit. They are finally submitting patches to the open source projects, which I'm super proud of. It took, again, it's really not a technical challenge for them. They were able to write those patches immediately. They were just reluctant on contributing. They didn't feel that they need to do anything. They didn't feel that this is good for them or for their company. So when we changed this attitude, they started submitting patches more than my company, which is a software vendor, produces by itself. So they also increased their deployment rate. They deployed as many data centers in 3 months as they did in a whole 2 years because they changed their attitude to the project. And obviously they're exploring other open source solutions, which are some of them are in competition with ours, but that's fine. This is all cool. they are one of the best companies to work for in the country they are from. I'm sorry, I can't talk about names, but it's irrelevant in this story. A telco being one of the most desirable places to work for. What do you think? Does it sound logic? Not really. Telcos are seen as the old, aging dinosaurs that are basically dying, but these guys have transformed their company from a telco into a software producing company. They're writing patches now, code. And we're talking about quite a big company, which is part of a even bigger groupation. And after all, they're sorry? Okay. So after all, their solution has been declared as the best in the group. And it was a year ago when the people were frustrated, nobody thought that they would succeed. And obviously they're industry leader in their field. And Telco B today, this is a telco that took everything off the shelf as an open source they didn't care about. There is also an industry leader because they were one of the first to the market. But they have a different operations model from the Telco B. So, from Telco A, sorry. So Telco A is trying to manage their own operations, manage manage the platform by themselves, etc. While Telco B was trying to outsource everything and not have an IT industry at all internally. So for them, this is great. They were faster to the market, but their development depends on us as the provider of the solution. So I think that's all. I was a bit quick. Any questions? I see disappointed faces. It was so short.
If you have questions, raise your arm.
Was it boring? You wanted to tell more about it?
Hey, can you share your advice? How would you develop a company with an open source model?
If there's a simple answer to that, then we would all be making a lot of money. As in every company that you start, there is a thing that people often neglect and is very, very important, and that is luck. Let's take an example of Red Hat, which is a great company that made a lot of money in open source. They were lucky that they entered the market exactly when others were looking for the alternative for the Unix. Anyone would succeed then. But they grabbed the opportunity. They were very lucky at that. They also had a good business model around that, so they introduced something new. But there is no guarantee for something. You always need to go you always need to take alternative paths. If you're trying to establish a model and disrupt the market that already exists, it cannot be in the same model that other companies are already doing. So whoever starts a Linux company with the subscription model, business model today, would fail. Red Hat just eats them. So it always needs to be something different. I'm sorry, I can't give you a... Yes? The advantage of? What is the advantage of Canonical?
You work with Canonical, correct?
Yes, I work for Canonical.
Okay, excellent.
So, Canonical does a lot of things. Probably most people know Ubuntu and the desktop Linux, but this is really not where we're making money. In fact, we walked away from that business. What we are currently working on and what we believe in is that the application orchestration is going to be the biggest challenge in the future, and it is today. And this is why we developed some technologies which allow us to deploy the same workload on a different substrate. So are we deploying our web application on top of Docker, on top of Amazon, on top of Azure, Google, physical machines, containers? We created tooling that allows us to do always that in the same way. And also, not just deploy, but operate that application later on. This is where we are banging our back. And obviously IoT, but this is new emerging market. Yes. So if I got it right, the question was, how do you persuade companies to change their investment strategy from products to people? And we don't even talk to those who didn't get that yet. So if the company doesn't understand that the people are the biggest asset, both asset and liability, or liability basically, then they're in the wrong business. The software, the business model where you're buying and selling software is gone because the software price is irrelevant for the whole price of any solution. The people are the biggest cost, and if you're not investing into people, you're going to lose those people, and you're going to lose the company in the end.
Code that do not.
I don't think there are many in the software company that exist yet that think in that way, that they still believe that the software is the biggest asset that they have. IBM just bought Red Hat for a specific reason, because they need people. They didn't buy them for technology. Technology is already there. It's open source. Microsoft is realizing, I think eventually, by the end of the next decade, we will not have Windows anymore, because it's going to be irrelevant which operating system you run on your system. Everything's going to be web-based. Right.
I was thinking about is the telco business that you were putting this context into. So actually, a telco company can run, everything from both products, or can develop its infrastructure by the people.
Yes. So luckily, I don't have to do that work for telcos. The telcos got into a weird situation where they are required for this world to operate, but they are insignificant. The WhatsApps, the Vibers, and Facebooks eat their lunch at the same time, depending on their existence. So telcos need to, and they have, majority, not all of them, but majority have understood that they need to move from an old style, this is going to be like this for the next 50 years, to a new, more agile approach to the market. And you can see that with, I can't talk about names, but you can see that with some telcos even in Croatia. Not all of them, but some. Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other question? Okay. That's all. Thank you all.